I'm the author of 4 books, Melbourne Geography, Bird and Warning, that's the story of Cyclone Tracy. And I've been kicking around the publishing industry for longer than I care to remember. To my left is Cate Kennedy. She's lives in Castlemaine. She's the author of the highly acclaimed novel The World Beneath, which won the People's Choice Award in the New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards in 2010, and was shortlisted for many other awards. She's an award-winning short story writer. She's twice won the Age Short Story competition. Are you one of the only people to have won that competition twice?
I think there's a couple. I think there's a few others. Yeah.
An alumni. Okay. Her collection Dark Roots was shortlisted for the Steel Rudd Award. And she's the author of the travel memoir Sing and Don't Cry, and the poetry collections Joy Flight and Signs of Other Fires. Her latest book is The Taste of River Water, New and Selected Poems. That's actually not your most recent book,
there's a short story collection called Like a House on Fire.
Like a House on Fire, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah. And she's also... She's a Jill of all trades. She also does a lot of teaching of fiction as an incredibly important figure in our writing culture.
No, I'm just a dilettante.
A dilettante, okay. Adrian Hyland, to my immediate left, is the award-winning author of Diamond Dove and Gunshot Road. He spent many years living in remote outback communities, and you see this very much in his Emily Tempest crime novels. He is also the author of Kinglake 350, which is how I came to his work, which is a non-fiction book about the experiences of local police officer Sergeant Roger Wood, who was in charge at Kinglake on February the 7th, 2009. And his book had a big influence on my book, Warning, the story of Cyclone Tracy, because trying to kind of write about these things is very difficult, and he lit the way for me to some extent. Before I move into sort of further discussion, I do want to acknowledge that we're speaking tonight on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. Now, sort of on that, one of the things I'd had been going to ask Alexis, but I still think is worth repeating here before we start our conversation, is something she wrote in an essay that was published in Meanjin. She said, "Are we not curious to know something about the deeply rooted beliefs of this country and why they were kept in place over many thousands of years? Why are we not hearing about any of these stories and trying to understand what they might mean?" She exhorted us to listen to the ancient stories of this country and that knowledge, the knowledge that goes back thousands of years. And she also said that she felt it was really important that people go through as well as looking at weather charts and records, that you actually have conversations with Indigenous people as a way of kind of mapping what has happened in Australia and what might be going to happen in the future. So Adrian, as an extension of that, one of the things I wanted to ask you was how much spending time in remote communities, Indigenous communities, how much that influenced your approach to writing landscape.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. I think, I went up to live in Central Australia working in Aboriginal communities at a very significant time back when I just left university in the early 80s. And it was a crucial time. In the 50s, a lot of people were moving into towns and those sort of places. And then when I was there, so in the 70s and late 80s, or 70s through the 80s, early 90s, there was a strong move for people to move back onto their traditional country. And I sort of came just as that was really at its peak, I suppose, in late or 79, 80. I went up there first, and I was working with very traditionally minded, particularly Warlpiri people who were moving back out into the Tanami Desert. And my job was really just to sort of go with them and help them. It was the sort of thing I'd pay to do as a holiday these days. It was a very moving and important experience for me. And in terms of the views they had of landscape, particularly I was working with that last and living with that last generation of people who'd grown up in the pre-contact days, and they had a sense of landscape which has never left me really. And it's sort of it's imbibed, seeped through everything that I've written and thought about ever since. I just might tell one little story that sort of summarises some of that view. But when I first went up there, I was travelling with a group of old men through the desert, and we travelled all day and we sort of sat around drinking tea and that at night. And then when sometimes I was drinking too much tea maybe, because sometimes I woke up and needed to have a leak. And I wandered my torch down to the creek bed nearby, and this massive great brown snake just sort of jumped up in my torchlight and sort of flared up at me, and I got a hell of a fright, and I threw the torch away and sort of trotted back to these old guys and came back to camp looking a bit worried, and one of the old fellows said, what's troubling you there? And I thought, it was a massive snake down the creek just down there. And the old bloke said, that's okay. And sort of, as he's rolling off back into his swag, he goes, takes a little bit of time for the country to get to know you. And I thought, that's just... And I thought there's enough sort of philosophy in that sentence, really, to write a dozen novels.
Absolutely.
I should say, when we went back to sleep, they were both sleeping on the back of the... When I woke up in the morning, they were both asleep on the back of the ute and I was still on the ground. So they're sort of practical as well as knowledgeable. And
Cate, you have lived in other cultures as well. You've lived in Mexico and Vanuatu. How did those experiences also affect how you thought about landscape?
Oh, look, they really did. In fact, I sometimes think now, looking at the sorts of, I don't know, the preoccupations that I sit down with to even start writing, or the sort of path that I feel I've kind of taken, and when I try and step back and look at stuff like, you know, the stories in a whole collection, or when someone points out to me that they can see some sort of overriding themes, I really notice this then, that it's all to do with kind of, I don't know, humans accepting their fundamental sort of powerlessness in the kind of general enormity of just what nature is, just that implacable thing that it is. It's not sort of something antagonistic or hostile or difficult or challenging. That's us projecting onto something far, far bigger and more incredible than we are. But just that lovely quote that you were saying before from Alexis about we need to talk to elders and old people. One thing I found in both of those cultures, Latin America and particularly so in the South Pacific, in Vanuatu, was that the elders, maybe this is true in a culture which is not so literate, I don't know, because certainly Vanuatu, being the oral culture that it is, old people are seen as the repositories of everything, of all stories and all wisdom, and also things like weather patterns and so on. They're like an almanac, you know, so there's that sense of stories are kind of part and parcel and tied up with us, as everything we need to know is already there because we've kind of lived a long time and we've seen lots of things happening and changing. Although I've got to say now, the elders in Vanuatu are really scratching their heads about climate change, that's for sure. You know.
What are they saying about it?
I'm sorry to say.
Not much. I mean, like, they don't know what to do.
They don't know. It's definitely right there in your face. There's no two ways about its existence for those people because they're seeing those changes right in front of them, and their kind of food security and stuff depends upon understanding weather and understanding what's happening from one day to the next in terms of planting and cycles and seasons and stuff. But because that culture's been really overwhelmed by sort of evangelical Christianity, a lot of people are saying the pastor says this is the end of days and it's a good thing because it's going to bring on the rapture. It's like, so it's like the flood again. It's like that idea of some great, you know, God-given sort of disaster, that the nature's going to be the thing. But of course, you know, the other thing I really feel is that nature always bats last, you know, like it's always going to be the thing that trumps us. It doesn't matter. So that powerlessness has been really important in my fiction, I guess. And yeah, I guess different cultures just show us that when you're in a place where your livelihood and life depends on the environment that you live in, that is not so denatured, say, as an industrialised society, that's when you really see it in front of you, yeah.
And I should say that Cate did a fantastic interview about her time in Vanuatu. It was Richard Feidler, wasn't it?
It was Richard,
that is worth downloading and listening to it.
Thanks.
If you want to hear more about that particular experience. When I was researching the Cyclone Tracy book, I spent time with a elder. He was quite a young elder, which is one of the issues that we're actually dealing with, is how young people are having to take on this mantle of responsibility. And like, did that Western thing of trying to break the ice by talking about the weather. Have you noticed the weather's changing and how come the rain hasn't come? And he just wouldn't answer me. And I was getting more and more anxious, and he said, "You don't just talk about the weather like that." You know, he was just like, that was actually as one of those things when someone says something and your understanding shifts. He said, it's not a subject to take lightly. I don't just chat about the weather when I meet someone. And yeah, that was probably one of the most useful things anyone said to me when I was working on this book, because there's something that is very. It's actually in all your works, Adrian, but you know, there's water being poisoned and mountainsides falling on people. There's a sense of the landscape in not always positive, but the momentum of things happening, but very obviously in the Kinglake book where the fire is literally surrounding people. And I know that working on a book about cyclones, you get that same sense of the energy of the landscape, that it moves, that it's organic, that it's all around you, and
it's interconnected too.
Yeah,
and
so in that sense, it is very definitely a character because it has volition in a sense, or it feels like it does. If maybe we're projecting onto it. So what I wanted to ask you both was whether you landscape is a character in your books. It's one of the reasons you've been asked on this panel. But is that something you consciously thought about, or is that just sort of something that happens in your work because of your worldview? Like, how much did you articulate that?
Do you want to?
You go.
You both have to answer it. So.
Okay. I just wasn't sure. Okay.
Yeah.
You know, I've become a little bit not irritated, but the idea of landscape being a character seems almost to diminish it in a way. And unless we look at the idea of character in a story, a protagonist or someone who acts, having sort of something in their path, do you know what I mean? Something that's an obstacle, stopping them from getting what they want. And in the classic kind of story mode or Greek mode, that's an antagonist, isn't it? That's someone who wants something different than you've got, or forces beyond your control, stopping you getting what you want. So we have these kind of blockbusters like a meteorite's going to hit Earth, or there's a massive snowstorm or whatever. And I guess that in that sense, yes, I can see how in the sense of form, it is a character. But to me, to say, oh, it's almost like landscape becomes a character in its own right in this book, it seems to make it. I think landscape is everything. You know, he said it's like it has its own volition. It is the volition. It is the thing which characters are pitting themselves against, to their own detriment, I must say, to their own kind of...
Well, that's what's wonderful about... Well, lots of wonderful things about the world beneath, but yeah.
It doesn't matter how much we try and do that. We are going to see our own smallness all the time, and so what's going to be revealed to us is not how hostile nature is towards us, or that, or how... What we're going to see, in fact, is how very little we understand about that kind of ourselves in that ecosystem. Ourselves as very, very small organisms with very little agency, because nature has all the agency, it has everything. And so the bigger that crisis, I guess, the more that's brought to a point. It's interesting that you said before about your book about Cyclone Tracy and Adrian's book about the big fires in 2009. Both those things, you look at the sort of human fallout from that and our kind of trying to cope or failing to cope with catastrophe on that scale is kind of like a shock to our kind of human capacity of understanding just how massive that power is, you know.
Even though one of the things about Cradle Mountain, though, which you write about, is how implacable it is. It's not moving, it's just there. It's just and itself. People are fleeing themselves.
It couldn't care less about us, you know. Yeah. It's just itself, it's just its own thing. But we like to kind of pit ourselves against it. But that's us, that's our sort of human desire to somehow be greater than it, or to conquer it, or to kind of map it, or to own it, or to create a path and a safety light and a place where you can get a cappuccino and that kind of stuff. It's that sort of sense of bring it down to a sort of a human scale, the way that cities are based on a human scale. Whereas once you leave a city, you realise how very denatured we've become, because we don't cope so well when we're out of our own sort of, literally our comfort zone, which is our human scale environment. That's how I feel. What do you think, Adrian?
Yeah, well, I'm just trying to think about what you're saying. I suppose I have two reactions to it. One is that from that time that I described living with Aboriginal, I did have this sort of sense of the interconnectedness of the whole thing, which I was just down looking at this wonderful exhibition by John Woolsey in the National Gallery.
Is that still, that's finished now, hasn't it?
No, it's still going, I think.
Oh, good, I'll make sure I go.
And I just noticed then a quote from him saying something about just him seeing himself as sort of a part of an interconnected web or something. And I had that strong sense. In that sense, I suppose, I have that sense of it. But also what you just reminded me about Cyclone Tracy and so on, I have this sense, like my main memory of, also one of those old men that I talked about initially, sometime after that there was an incident happened where a mining company took a rock that was important to his dreaming, and he said to me some comment like, it felt like an eagle hawk was tearing his insides out when that happened. And a few weeks later, he was dead. So I had a very strong sense of, just that interconnectedness. But also in relation to like that, I suppose that's a manifestation of the power of it. But I had a similar feeling, I suppose, on Black Saturday when it was. I was sitting up on the roof of my house, because our house is right at the sort of base of the Kinglake Ranges, and it was after the sun had gone down, just sort of sitting there looking up at it, and it was just like the world was full of, the whole thing was just full of fire as far as you could see, everything just burning, and I just felt kind of overwhelmed by it, really.
Did that experience, well, it must have, I mean, it's a silly question really, but you build on your understanding of what landscape was, having had that kind of more philosophical and lived experience in the 80s, but then going through something of such extreme violence must have had a real impact.
Build upon it in one sense, but sort of hit me in the, smacked me in the face in another sense. Particularly because it was not long after we started hearing about people we knew who died. The phone calls started happening within, late that night they started happening, and I was sitting there looking up at the hills where a lot of people I knew lived, and I was just, had this sense of fear and awe at the whole thing, and then by about midnight we started hearing of people we knew who'd died, so it just sort of rammed it home.
Absolutely.
There are two, in the world beneath, Rich, it's his ignorance that really undoes him, like he thinks he's on top of the whole situation when he's doing the track, and in Kinglake, what I was really struck by was the passivity of some people who are just sort of standing out, standing in the middle of fire, waiting for someone to help them.
Yeah, waiting for a big red truck to arrive.
So I suppose I wanted you both to speak to that kind of. Well, you've touched on ignorance, really, but
it's kind of an arrogance too, I suppose, isn't it? And ignorance and arrogance together is not an attractive combo, is it? It's always going to be troublesome, and I guess for a character that's a great combination to create someone with that sort of problem. He does that thing that I've noticed quite a lot of people do of my generation, which to prepare for that adventure, that long walk, he goes to the kind of upmarket wilderness shop and he buys all the top of the range gear, because with the gear, that's his kind of armour plating. If you've got the right sleeping bag, you're going to be okay. If you've got these boots in the catalogue, you're going to be okay. So you stand there in front of that with your $500 boots on, feeling like a jackass, because suddenly you're really out of your league. We're always going to be out of our league in a place which is... But that whole wilderness experience, that idea of sort of commodifying wilderness so that we can walk it. We want, we say, well, I want to do it. I want to do Copenhagen. I want to go and do...
Well, now people do the Kokoda Trail.
That's right, do the Kokoda Trail. That's right. I want to kind of have it and be it and conquer it in some way. Whereas I'm just thinking now, I wasn't actually in Australia at the time of the 2009 fires. I was having a little holiday in New Zealand. And we're on the South Island.
Good move.
I tell you, it's very interesting. We hardly ever left the farm, and we lived in northeast Victoria. I lived there for 13 years on this farm. And you always feel like you've got it all staked out. You've got your firefighting gear ready. You've got your plan on the fridge. You've got everyone's psyched about getting ready. You never have more than one beer on Christmas Day because the call come. It's just you are living and breathing, waiting for that. And of course, on that 10 days, we happened not to be there. Now, my husband is a volunteer firefighter, and we were sitting at this little place in the South Island, and there was a warm breeze. It's like I say about the sky. He just looked up at the sky and he said, something is wrong. We were in New Zealand. He said, something's not right. There's too much carbon in the, it's too much warmth. And he got in the car and he drove down to town to go on to check out something on the internet, and came back and said, there's a really big fire and it's still burning out of control. Victoria, but just that whole idea of you can be across an ocean and still be, as you said, having that kind of hyped up awareness, because you're always vigilant, I guess. It was just too warm and the sky was the wrong colour. Even there, So it's kind of that idea that I don't think in lots of ways, I think you're right when you say we're interconnected, we're part of that web, that little...
But we're disconnecting ourselves.
We are totally always trying to kind of pull ourselves away and think, well, I'm okay, I've got my GPS, or I can always get someone to come along and help me, or I'm not going to have to see how very small I am, or see how very powerless I am.
So how did you, because in a way your book, you divide people between those who became very active in the face of what was happening and those who kind of retreated into some kind of delusion. That must have been quite hard to write about, because obviously I assume good friends of yours actually, did the retreating. A lot of people
died, yeah. What I was going to say is, I suppose when you first asked that question, the image that I had, I was talking to a captain from the brigade next to ours, and who'd been in the Strathhew and was very much involved in finding bodies and so on. And he said the thing that he'd hated most was hearing of people whose last minutes on Earth were spent looking at a computer screen, telling them that the fire that was in fact coming over the hill and about to kill them was still back in Kilmore or somewhere. And just that, he said, why can't people just sort of go outside and look at the sky? It'll give you a much better idea than any computer screen ever would. And it was just, particularly, the worrying thing was particularly young people were more inclined than, so it's like that obsessive reliance on technology was potentially having a terrible effect. There were so many people who, there were so many people whose sort of reaction that day was to just sort of close all the windows and turn on the air conditioner and put on a DVD. There's one, I don't remember how true it was, but someone told me of one story where someone who's first learnt that their house was on fire by noticing some sort of fluid dripping down in the walls, and that was a helicopter bombing their house because the back of their house was on fire.
They were still inside watching TV with air conditioning.
I presume so, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, but perhaps the other worst thing was talking to another bloke I know who's a CFA captain maybe 2 or 3 years later, saying he thought if it happened again today, the results would be more or less the same.
Yeah, that's one of the things when I was researching Cyclone, is how little warnings help. Yeah. Even though I must admit, living in a place where the big danger is earthquakes, where there's not even going to be a warning, I find quite terrifying, because I think you have the illusion that you could somehow do something, whereas I think with an earthquake, I was reading the instructions, because there was one that was only 4.2 the other day, but it gave me a terrible fright because I was in bed and it woke me up, and the instructions were, if you're in bed when it hits, put a pillow over your head. And I was like, that's what I did. I had a great instinct for the right thing to do. But you like to think that if you have a warning, you can manage the situation, but I think that's a little bit of a delusion. Illusion, maybe.
I know that a lot of people around where I live, say at Panton Hill, which is the next closest town, they had a community meeting a day or two later, and a lot of people were getting very upset at the CFA, saying, why didn't you set off the alarms? And they said, well, actually we did set off the alarms, just that it was because everyone was inside with the air conditioner, no one actually heard it.
I wanted to ask you both about research which you, with your thrillers, Adrian, rather than the Kinglake, did you give it to any Indigenous friends to read, to talk about how you'd kind of approach some of these issues? And Cate, I wanted to know whether you'd walked that track yourself. And
let's ask Adrian first. Sure.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, look, I know that's always. I know what you're getting is a bit of. I hadn't really lived in that community for about 10 years when I wrote it. I was always writing when I was there. I suppose there's a bit of a sense of, or perhaps another time, when I'll just one little story as an example, I suppose. I mean, the short answer is no, I didn't, because I was very private. You know, I suppose writing is a pretty secluded sort of activity. I'd shown bits. I'd worked doing adult literacy type programs with Aboriginal people over the years, and I'd sort of, sometimes shared the stories and things that we were writing. But I just was going to tell one little story from when I'd been in this community for about 10 or 11 years at this stage, and we were about to come back home, and there were these 3 old ladies who'd been sort of asking me for months to take them out to their little community right out at a place that didn't even exist on the maps, just a little waterhole. And it was my last couple of days, I took them out there, and we spent a lovely couple of days just cruising around the desert, and they were sort of singing songs and telling me stories and so on. And at night I'd sort of sit there and scribble away some of the stories and things that they were telling me. And then I remember just one of those ladies leaning over and saying, "You've got enough light there? You've got to get this story done the right way." She said, "White fella's got to know this story." So, I mean, I suppose I felt in a sense that those women, although they all sort of, none of them would have even known how to read or write, but they were conscious of the fact that someone had to get some of their stories out. And
stories.
And that's one of the things I was trying to do when I wrote those books.
I certainly felt I've learnt a lot about Indigenous views of landscape by looking at art rather than reading, because there's not the same distinction between landscape and human figures and animal figures. They're kind of all part.
No, that's right.
Now, Cate, did you do the walk?
I didn't. I knew you were going to say that. I wrote the book in 2008. 2009 I finished it, it came out. And in 2008 my daughter was 2, and I just couldn't see myself doing the walk with a 2-year-old. I had done it 20 years before, more or less, when I went down. So the walk usually takes about 4 it's
days,
about
a week?
I think it can take about 7 days, yeah. Right. Most people break it up, but it's getting so popular. It's getting kind of loved to death now, that walk. Now you recommend it only to go in the one direction. So there was lots of things about it when I kind of began to research, as if I was going to do it, that I thought, that's stuff that I'll be able to kind of use, and it's good to have that kind of limitation and restriction for these characters. And also I remembered I had been down in Tasmania when the Franklin blockade was on. I wasn't part of the blockade, but I was studying journalism at college, and I went down and did a little kind of story on it, and went on part of the walk then, and that was way back in 83, so it was a long time before, but I was able to kind of dig up a few contacts and meet a few people, one of whom was one of the oldest protesters at the time, and his name was John Hale. I think he was 81, 82 when I met him. And he said, "I waited a long time for you to come and visit me," and he had a folder full of stuff, which was a great thing to get. And I also spoke to a great guy called Bill Forsyth, who knows the walk back to front, because he goes and does repairs and stuff to the track, which needs to be repaired now because of all the people doing the walk. And so the other really useful thing that I had, because I was at home with the 2-year-old instead of trying to imagine myself into the walk, was I did pick up a lot of interesting maps and stuff from Parks and Wildlife. But the other thing is, people tend to blog a lot in this very way that I'm talking about. People blogged about their walk. Right. Yeah. And about what they did day to day and what they ate and what they saw and how they found it and how gruelling it was. And it was easier to kind of create my characters through the kind of voices that I'd got from these people who kind of saw it as a way to write themselves into a story, often in a very kind of heroic way, but often because they were kind of doing something like doing the walk as a kind of a promise or a dare, or a fundraising thing, or something where they had a kind of a cause. They had a reason for doing it, putting on a backpack and doing it. It is interesting.
That is some sense of conquering landscape, isn't it? That kind of doing the thing. I know that I did a session with Will Self at the Writers' Festival last week, and he was getting very cranky about the idea of charity walks. Not saying that there's anything wrong with charity so much as they're not really walks, they're about something else, and a commodification of walking, and that you can only walk if you have a reason rather than you
so
can
we
never
give ourselves
be
a
aimless
reason.
or...
Yeah. Whereas on the other hand, I do tend to think that the way to actually do something memorable, well, doing again, it's like the protagonist, you know, the person who acts, isn't it? The way to actually to do something that you're going to recall and remember as being sort of a challenge to yourself is especially with other people, is not just to be with people, but to do things with people, to either go through something that's beyond your own control or to do something of your own volition, to do something. I can see how people sort of form teams to do stuff, or to build a house together, or to revegetate a block together, or to go on some sort of challenging trip together, because it does sort of create a kind of a shared memory. And to be in a place together, you do want to do stuff. You do want to kind of interact with, you know, it's with the landscape that you're in. I do when I go somewhere new. I want to go for walks and climb those mountains and get in that ocean and stuff.
I actually find walking can be a way to character as well, which is kind of the landscape giving you kind of some kind of information. Or so. I mean, this is part of my blog that I'm writing a novel on Leonard Woolf. It's been going for 10 years. I don't know if I'll finish it. However, I've been researching and written some of a novel on Leonard Woolf, and as part of that I walked Southdown Way because I knew that that's where he walked a lot, and I felt that would be, apart from the fact I love walking, it would be a way towards some understanding of what kind of person he might be. And I did something similar with a novel set in India where I did a trek, which was partly just trying to understand what it might be like to be a pilgrim in that particular case.
Look at walking the Camino is such a fashionable thing now, isn't it? To kind of go and do those pilgrims' walks. In fact, Bill Forsyth, the guy who was the track expert that I spoke to in Tasmania, had just finished doing the Camino through Spain, which is the sort of pilgrimage walk, and he had the kind of beautiful plaque up in his house, which the Latin, which is solvitur ambulante, which means it is solved by walking. Your whole kind of spiritual quest is solved by just putting one foot in front of the other and keeping on going until you've kind of addressed those questions to yourself. So I think interacting with the landscape that you're in is a really important thing. But there's looking at that kind of rural-urban thing, which is very preoccupying to lots of Australian writers, I think. One of the things that I feel is there's a big difference between the way you see yourself if you live outside metropolitan Australia. If you live in the Australian landscape, it's a very problematic kind of thing because sometimes you need to make your living from that landscape and sometimes you don't. And there's like a kind of, this is where the division seems to come for me. It's like you've got no control over that. If you're trying to make a reliable or earn a reliable living from the landscape, and you have no control over, say, the weather. You have to use it to some extent. Yeah, you lose control. You don't have control over these primary kind of drivers because you can't make it rain. You can be a fantastic farmer and you can work 15 hours a day, 7 days a week. It doesn't mean you're going to actually be able to get out of the red because you're not in control of any of these factors. So it's a very different kind of way of interacting with the place where you end up living. You actually, I think, tackled this to some extent, Adrian, in Diamond Dove and Highway Road. Sorry, I've gone slightly. Gunshot Road. Gunshot Highway.
Gunshot Road.
Because while they're very remote, I mean, the landscape is a remote landscape, they're very problematic landscapes because of the sense of mining, people trying to dig them up and do all kinds of things, and the Indigenous people there are trying to find their continue their connection despite the fact there's so much disruption of what the place was like. So they're very much landscapes in flux.
Yeah.
Is that partly because that was your experience when you were living there?
Absolutely,
were you making political political comments about mining, or kind of what was it kind of your conscious kind of?
I think there were two things I'd say. One is that a lot of my work did involve negotiating with mining companies and arguing with them. And like that example I mentioned before of the rock that was taken and the old bloke who died, that was taken by a mining company and disrupted. So I had this very strong sense of those people who were, under threat. But also I saw that in that world, those questions that we sort of talk about, in a sense, perhaps from a more theoretical perspective in the city, they tend to be raw matters of life and death in those remote communities. And I just sort of I see that those arguments, be they, I suppose you call it basically conservation versus progress schools, just sort of laid bare with the effects of and the poorest people in the community suffering the brunt of them.
And how do you sort of live now you live near, as you said, in St Andrews, and that's a sort of suburbanised rural area, so it's a kind of the hinterland, if you like, of the city.
Yeah, when I look at the fires, I wish it was a bit more urbanised.
Yeah, I was going to say, how do you feel, like, what does it feel like the country, or do you feel very much in modified landscapes living in those kind of outer...
Where I live, I feel, and we're sort of part of an area that can go through national or state forest, all the way up in the Kinglake Ranges, so I have a very strong sense of actually living in the bush, and I have a very, very strong sense of the Aboriginality of that land. And often, when I'm walking through it and just sitting down watching it, I sort of think about the people who've lived here for so many years, and how they've shaped. Particularly, it's one of the things I learned from doing the research for that book. I didn't realise quite how much the Aboriginal occupancy had shaped that land and formed it, and how that, and then we'd come along and basically destroyed that relationship through two things, through initially through overburning, and then through trying to suppress fire. So I felt that we'd basically damaged that landscape, and where I live, I try and do my best to preserve it. We live on quite a big acreage.
Certainly, when I was working on my book about Melbourne, my way of trying to understand the landscape that might have been here before, which is very hard to do when everything has been so changed, was to get a sense of how water worked in the landscape, because I came to understand that there were a lot of wetlands, not swamps. Swamps is a sort of more negative, and that the Yarra had been a lot wider, and that sort of the flooding and retracting, which caused such problems, were the early settlers was totally normal and part of what was expected, and the way the river was deepened and narrowed, and kind of an attempt to kind of contain the river was one of the early acts of settlers as a way of kind of modify the landscape so they could live here with it, even though it did keep flooding anyway. It wasn't totally successful, and I think Elizabeth Street still floods all the time. I mean, not as badly as it used to, but that's basically a creek. So I actually get quite... I like the idea of the landscape kind of continuing to kind of, even if it's being suppressed, you can never totally suppress it.
Well, absolutely, no. That was my main feeling from Black Saturday, that you can't suppress it. It just comes back and destroys you ultimately. And I felt that with the way Aboriginal, I learned a lot about the way Aboriginal people I'd known it from the territory, but it sort of struck me even more clearly looking at our local landscape. I just remember reading somewhere that a traditional family back then would have lit about 5,000 fires a year. So it was just a constant progress of fire as they walked through the landscape. So, and in our trying to remove that, that's one of the most damaging things we'd done.
Now, one of the things about writing about landscape is also wanting to write about the animals within that landscape, because they're not really as separate as... they're codependent in a way that... and so I was very struck by your talk about the Tasmanian tiger in The World Beneath, Cate. What were you... with the people's fantasy, or maybe not fantasy, people's hope that it might still exist and what that might represent, that people really thought there was still a chance it was out there?
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? We have this lingering, yearning need for something mythic to still be present in our lives, I suppose. And we love the idea of the wilderness surviving. I think we know on some level it's surviving almost in spite of us. I really sort of agree with what Adrian's saying about that idea of our history is one of disruption, and seeing the landscape as a sort of a resource to be used, and its usefulness is very much dictated by how much it concedes to our will, I suppose. And if it doesn't, then we immediately begin to feel hostile towards it and try to use it in some way. Even that sort of idea of a resource, is that something that we can use? As we look at a forest in terms of metres of lumber, that kind of stuff, you know.
And if you spot the Tasmanian tiger, you get a big reward. So there's a lot of money.
That's right. There was a big reward, yeah. If you're going to find and people do apparently still come from all over the world hoping to spot the thylacine, and I was lucky enough to be able to go and have a look in the Museum of Tasmania down there in Hobart, in this kind of storeroom. It was such an amazing experience. I just had to give it to my characters, and they did the same thing. I went and looked in this room and was taken in by the curator, and there were just like stacks and stacks of pelts, and there were boxes of, you know, bits and pieces, thylacine bits and pieces stuck on with a post-it note, you know, and it was, and they had these stuffed thylacines and that had been kind of very poorly stuffed and mounted, and around the sort of, you know, the wrists of the thylacine, you could still see where the snare had rubbed all that fur. It was really, it was very disturbing. And there were boxes and boxes of letters from people, not just claiming that they had seen them, but also wanting money to mount research projects and expeditions. Even today, and you could look. I had a big look at this pile and just pulled it up, and it went from sort of computer printed letters, right down to typewritten letters, right down to biro-written letters, right down to fountain pen written letters. You know, like we have always had this same kind of urge to want to not believe, in fact, that we have created an extinction, that something's gone to the end point from which there is no return. And then we can't
fix it.
We can't fix it.
I've been having arguments with my half-brother recently. He's been volunteering for an organisation called Frozen Ark in London, where they've kept animals that are extinct. They've got keeping DNAs with the hope that they can kind of reintroduce them. I mean, it's sort of obvious, as maybe slightly silly example might be a mammoth. But I've been saying I'm not really sure what the point of bringing a mammoth back would be if there isn't the environment, or if there's nowhere to put it, and what kind of. And then he was saying they want to put them in zoos, and I was saying, I'm not quite sure what the point of that is.
We're hard-pressed keeping our own sort of animals that we still actually have alive in sustainable numbers at the moment. We're rapidly pushing many of them to the point of no return too. Some people think we're pushing ourselves to the point of no return. We actually are using every last, you know, bit of resource we possibly can, and we don't want to see that we have this kind of agency of being destructive. We have this yearning, deep mythic need, I think, to actually see that were we just to stop this headlong rush, we could actually re-establish ourselves as part of another kind of ecosystem where these things could actually have another kind of equilibrium or harmony again, you know.
And it's one of the things that Alexis Wright does so beautifully in the Swan book is capture the kind of poignancy and beauty of creatures that are in possibly becoming extinct. Well, humans also, whose way of life, but the swans and the landscape and the way that kind of ruination. There's a kind of tenacious, things hold on, even though you're not really left with a sense of whether they will continue to hold on. But it just describes this kind of ruined, but still, there's just something still going on that landscape, an attempt to kind of capture life until there is no life. We could chat for hours. However, I would like to open to questions.
What I'm thinking about is that in parts of the world today, as observed by us, the educated, that Indigenous tribal communities always have those stories. Now, whether it be on this continent or elsewhere, they have the stories, and that what seems to happen is that encounter with the unbounded nature leads to what's curiously, I know the old scholars like Heraclitus used to have a name for it, an antiodromia. That is, when confronted by something in a massive or absolute form, it suggests, in fact, invites us to consider its opposite. Now, what I want to put it to you here is this, and mention of myth brings this up anyway. The natural, when we encounter the natural and ourselves feel as if we are possessed by it, then the supernatural invites itself. For so many people, their belief in the supernatural in whatever form of... They believe, for instance, that nature has not been continuous but got created, and that some conscious agent created nature, that what I would be interested in is a little more of, if you could explore why it is that nature in its extreme form invites the natural in its extreme form invites the supernatural. Is this a peculiarity of our species, or is it only a cultural thing of our civilization?
I'm not going to attempt to answer the question, but certainly it's something I've been thinking about, because I do think in a time of so much extinction, I'm interested to know what does that do to our souls, for whatever bit. What does it mean to be surrounded by a world in these times? I don't know what if.
Okay. Well, I'm not a religious person. I can only answer as someone who is interested in story, and it does seem to me that the world as we experience it seems to be a very random, arbitrary, chaotic place, full of flux, full of injustice, full of incoherent stuff that does not seem story-like. And I think what we try and do, because it's just all overwhelming, is try and create something that is coherent, that is cogent. And the biggest story of all, of course, is that there's a bigger system, there's a bigger consciousness than ours at work, making this story-like, that there's some big story getting written of which we are a very small part. We can live with that. We can't live with the randomness or the enormous kind of arbitrary chaos and flux that is the natural world. It's overwhelming for us, I think. So to me, it's a kind of it's a yearning towards a story-like sense of everything making sense for us.
Thank you. I fully agree. This is the starting point for the study of mythology.
Yeah. What do you think, Adrian?
Well, I suppose my reaction to one of the things that used to strike me about various mythological based society, like with Warlpiri people, for example, they had this sense of fire as being a living thing, fire as life, and it's the same in other cultures, in Ainu and in Vedic cultures and so on. There's stories that support that, and I'd always just sort of thought of it as a myth. But in doing a lot of the research about fires, there's sort of, even in science at present, we don't actually think of fire as having life, but life and fire are sort of so closely connected and essential to each other. They sort of spin around each other like orbiting stars. And I suppose there comes a sense where there's a lot of truth in those myths that you just described, and they do, in that interconnectedness, it does lead to a kind of sense of a world beyond the material that we see. That's what I'm getting at. And
and certainly particular landscapes evoke some sense of sort of grandeur that to me feels extremely spiritual, but so I can very much understand that reaction. But big rocks do it for me.
In a landscape of not much else, and there's a big rock. Yeah.
El Capitan, which is in Yosemite, you do kind of just stand staring at these huge hunks of granite, and for hours.
We want them to have a sentience, don't we? Because they do feel. We have, as humans, I think, a huge sense of the sacred, if we just let that in. And that's not religious, I don't think. That's a kind of a sense that there's something bigger, that we are a small part of that. We're just
and then that's okay. I think it's almost
great to sit and feel our own parameters of our own powerlessness. That's a fantastically spiritual thing, I think, and a very useful one, actually, for us denatured, industrialised white people anyway,
There's another question there in the middle.
Thanks very much. I wonder, does being attentive to landscape provide challenges in terms of narrative structure and how you attempt to write landscape without attempting to, sort of appropriate its forms or flux or chaos or change that in any way?
I think that's an excellent question.
Right. I suppose what I think the best landscape writing does is, and the best writing is not just sort of talk about landscape, but try and manifest it. I always have trouble explaining it. I have a sort of strong sense of language that's working well. That, like I was just reading just recently a poem by an Australian poet I really like called John Kinsella, and he was describing. It was a solar panel that had been left. I actually got it. I meant to bring it with me, but a solar panel that was left lying against the front of a car, and then when the sun had gone down, it was just sort of noticed it, and there was still a bit of colour or life or something just spinning in those particles, and just reading it, you had such a strong sense that this wasn't just a person who was writing about landscape, or he was just manifesting in his words. And I find that a very clear distinction between people who can do that and people who can't. And those who do it, to my mind, are much better. Right? Like, for example, I think of Coleridge and Wordsworth. I think Coleridge does it, and he sort of has a strong sense of just living in colour in his words, and whereas Wordsworth tends to have more ideas, I find, and I just find that's why I sort of go for Coleridge so much.
It took a few more drugs.
This actually goes back to the previous question to some extent. I mean, I think a lot of cultures do use peyote, or I can pronounce peyote, or use kind of hallucinogenics as a way of kind of feeling that, helping understand the connection they might feel. But one of the things I wanted to say about Adrian's writing is that, because I agree with the question that it can be very hard to kind of create momentum and plot if you're focusing a lot on landscape. But in your novels, the landscape actually provides quite dramatic plot points. I mean, in your fiction and your non-fiction. It's sort of, so the landscapes, in a very literal sense,
landslides and so on.
Yeah, exactly. So that landscape actually provides momentum, I think, in your work.
For me, I think I probably cheated in my book because I had people on a walk, and I could break up that walk into 7 days, and I could create something that happened in terms of the landscape pushing back each time, that pushes character onto doing different sorts of things. So I was very conscious of the fact that, that nature itself is not going to provide us with convenient kind of obstacles for a protagonist necessarily. What it does do is show a protagonist just how small they are, I suppose, because it's so supremely indifferent to me. And the wilder the place and the bigger our expectations, the more that collision course is on its way, I guess. But I guess for me, it's, I write poems as well, and most of my poems seem to be about nature. And I remember reading something about a critique on poetry that said, it wasn't me, but this poet uses nature as for inspiration, nature, that hackneyed old chestnut. Or something. I thought, my God, what am I going to do? It's like I can't imagine a life long enough to keep exploring, that sort of interface between human consciousness in smack up against the world. Really, that is the material, isn't it? In fact, the epigram of my latest book is, "In the battle between you and the world, back the world." Which is Kafka. It's that idea that we are never going to find our boundary here. We're going to lose our footing all the time, and we're going to return again and again to our same small, imperfectly understood preoccupations all the time, because here is the world constantly. As Thoreau says, nature abhors a vacuum. If I can just walk with sufficient carelessness, I am sure to be filled. I just love that idea of that inspiration. It's like, just trust that if you can be mindful and empty, you know what, the world's going to come in and show you what you need to be looking at. So it's somehow to get to that mindful state, that is the great source of what the natural world is going to be able to give us,
I remember reading an essay about Virginia Woolf, and it was asking questions about whether or not she was religious, and she said she wasn't as such, but it was actually Michael Cunningham who'd written this essay, who wrote a novel about her. But one of the things he said about her is that she was deeply spiritual when it came to her relationship with nature, and that she kind of communed with it day after day, and had kind of intense relationship to the world around her, which effectively stood in for what you would have called Christianity in that particular
and that's
case.
That's the growth edge of what's happening in her thinking,
Do we have any more questions? Okay, well, I've got one last question for... there is a question, okay?
There is one.
Often I think we talk about the dichotomy of technology and nature as being kind of diametrically opposed. What are your thoughts about not in sort of different ways as stories being a way of connecting to nature. What are your thoughts around technology as being a means to connect to nature and a sort of a coping mechanism for us to kind of, or a means to access nature and a means to better understand nature, and rather than drawing us away from nature, perhaps drawing us into nature and bridging that kind of dichotomy?
I think on a personal level I would agree that you can actually, I'm a bit like the Rich in the novel. That is, I do adventurous things, but I like to have the kind of equipment to somehow support it. So in that sense that I do think sometimes having things can help you feel brave about tackling things. But you obviously have strong views about this.
You know, part of what I feel is when I hear about sort of technological innovation that, say, allows people to have a kind of a, for example, experience a place without having to actually physically go to that place, or to have a kind of a experiential, you know, endeavour where they can... Part of me thinks, good, stay out of Antarctica, you know what I mean? You don't have to go. You don't have to go and plant your flag there or prove you've been there or step on that thing. Stay home and have a better than real experience. That's great. I think, and I'm not being critical about that. I'm totally into that. I think we need to actually understand that the best thing sometimes we can do for the natural world is just get out of the way and not have to fly there, really. That's the bit I do, the walk in the wilderness. I feel like saying, if you want to give money to support that landscape, that's a great way to do it. Give the money and don't have to go, you know, like just... because I feel this terrible sort of sense that we are eating it all alive. We are loving it to death. And so part of me thinks technology is a fantastic way. Nothing makes me happier than kicking back at home watching a David Attenborough DVD about migratory birds and not having to kind of go and do any actual, you know, flying somewhere to do bird watching. Do you know what I mean? And I love the idea that I'm actually able to understand a whole range of stuff with sort of minimal intervention. It's lovely to be able to experience that, I think. But I don't know, I'm not...
there are a lot of four-wheel drives in your books.
I'm not a four-wheel drive person, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm not a four-wheel drive person either, but no, I just think it's a two-edged sword. I mean, I suppose technology, even the field guide that I take to identify orchids and things when I go for a walk is technology, but I just... as with Cate, I'm just very aware that the technology that might make things a bit easier, it's the same breath it's destroying things as well.
On that, I don't mean to... Oh, sorry, you've got one more brief.
I would like to say something else, please. Thank you. We have reached a time in human history when man-made structures are themselves part of landscape, and that there are some people who now, in our lifetimes, and even for a generation prior to that, who could have lived long lives and died without ever having stepped into an untouched or unspoiled part of the planet.
Well, in fact, most people.
And maybe it is now most people, but here's my point, that until recent times, only the last couple of generations, wherever there were townships and cities, the tallest buildings, the tallest structures were ones of worship. That whatever was the sacred was the tallest. Yep. We now find in these past two generations that the tallest buildings in our landscape, the one we're in right now, is about commerce. That is, that the sacred has become commercial. And what I really worry about is that we've got new generations growing up who will accept economic doctrines as though they were natural.
That's Naomi Klein is talking about that at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, I think, this weekend, and I would actually suggest people listen to her speech, which I think you can stream. She was touching on some of these things at the Melbourne Writers' Festival. We do have to finish now, so I'd like to thank our guests, Cate and Adrian.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.